the International Youth and Students for Social Equality fully condemns the Labor government's takeover of the CFMEU. This is a dictatorial measure, an attack on the entire working class and its basic democratic rights. The same Albanese Labor government that is imposing state control over tens of thousands of building workers is attacking the democratic rights of workers and youth as a whole. This has been most sharply expressed by the government's response to the mass opposition to the Israeli genocide in Gaza. This historic war crime, the destruction and ethnic cleansing of the Palestinian people in Gaza, has sparked opposition around the world among millions of workers and particularly young people. The Australian government, which is actively involved in the genocide, together with the United States and all the major imperialist powers, is responding to this opposition with police state measures. University students across the country have been slandered by state and federal governments as anti-Semitic for their opposition to the far-right Zionist regime of Benjamin Netanyahu in Israel. For their involvement in peaceful protests against war, students are facing disciplinary actions from universities, including suspension and even expulsion. Increasingly, students are being arrested by police called onto campuses. In Western Sydney University earlier this month, heavily armed police officers violently arrested 2 protesting students, throwing them to the ground and against a wall. A third student was arrested the following day at her home. These anti-democratic attacks are an assault on freedom of speech and the right of students and young people to speak out against a horrific genocide that's now expanding into a region-wide war, including the onslaught against Lebanon and preparations for a US-Israeli war on Iran. Labor's unstinting support of the Gaza genocide is bound up with its broader support for the war aims of US imperialism. This means preparing for major wars with Washington's 2 main rivals, Russia and China. In fact, Australia is viewed by the US as an absolutely key ally in preparing for a catastrophic conflict with China in the Indo-Pacific region. In preparation for this conflict, Labor has accelerated Australia's militarisation, expanding military bases, acquiring weapons, developing wartime alliances such as AUKUS and the Quad, and massively expanding military budgets. All of this requires a stepped-up attack on the conditions and rights of the working class and youth. War abroad means war at home. It's under these conditions that the Labor government has placed the construction wing of the CFMEU under state administration. As the Australian ruling class prepares for war, it must turn towards authoritarian forms of rule to suppress mass opposition from below. This is the context for the wholesale assault on the population's democratic rights that we're witnessing today. Labor's attacks on the CFMEU and on students demonstrating against war and genocide are fundamentally interlinked. Its dictatorial moves are not the product of bad individuals in the Labor Party. Labor is a political representative of Australian capitalism, whose interests are totally opposed to those of workers and young people. As workers are coming into struggle with Labor, a critical role is being played by the trade union bureaucracies and the pseudo-left groups in tying the growing opposition to Labor and the capitalist political framework. For example, over the past year, trade unions have actively prevented workers from taking any industrial action against the Gaza genocide. Not a single strike has been called by a union in this country against the genocide. That's bound up with the union's deep ties to the Labor government, on behalf of which it is tasked with suppressing opposition amongst workers to war and authoritarianism. While the unions are suppressing any struggle from workers against the Israeli genocide, they're also blocking any mobilisation of workers against Labor's CFMEU takeover. The sporadic, isolated community protests organised by the ousted CFMEU leaders are designed to channel workers into futile appeals to the very government that enacted the legislation against them in the first place. The bureaucracy is aiming to block the development of an independent political program among building workers. The trade union's role as a political police force is buttressed by fake left organisations such as Socialist Alternative, Socialist Alliance, and Solidarity. These groups have sought to limit the mass anti-war movement to moral appeals to the Labor government to end its complicity in the genocide, and to university managements to sever ties with Israeli-linked weapons manufacturers. This has been a deliberate trap advanced by the pseudo-left because they represent the interests of an affluent upper middle class, whose interests are bound up with capitalism itself. Pseudo-left groups are tied by 1,000 strings to Labor and the union bureaucracy, that is, the chief enforcers of the program of the corporate elite and the war drive. The pseudo-left's role is to prevent any independent political struggle by the working class against these pro-capitalist forces. In other words, these groups are not fighting the genocide, but are doing everything they can to defend the political forces that are directly complicit in the mass murder of the Palestinians. Therefore, the fight to mobilise the working class against war and capitalism means a political struggle against the pseudo-left. That is the program of the IYSSE and its parent organisation, the Socialist Equality Party, to establish the political independence of the working class and youth as the only way forward to stop war and dictatorship. That means an uncompromising political struggle against all capitalist parties, from the Liberal National Coalition to Labor, the Greens, and their accomplices in the trade union apparatus and the pseudo-left. The IYSSE fights to turn young people actively towards the working class as the only force in society that can be mobilised to end war and the attacks on democratic rights. And it must be mobilised against all these pro-capitalist forces, including the pseudo-left, on a program of socialism and internationalism. That's why the IYSSE fully supports construction workers in their struggle against Labor's attack on the CFMEU. We're not just supporting workers as a verbal gesture of solidarity, we are fighting to explain to young people that their struggle for a future free of war and fascism is intricately bound up with the struggles of the working class for their rights and conditions, and must be linked up in a common struggle against capitalism. On the day before the arrests of students at Western Sydney University, the IYSSE's club on campus there organised a special general meeting to discuss a socialist strategy to oppose the Israeli genocide and imperialist war. IYSSE members presented a motion to the meeting, which was adopted by an overwhelming majority vote of the students present. And I want to read out the 5 proposed actions outlined in that motion. 1. We call for an immediate end to the genocide in Gaza and imperialist militarism and violence globally. 2. We endorse the call of the Palestinian trade unions and urge that workers demand it be implemented by the Maritime Union of Australia and other transport unions. 3. But recognising that they have failed to do so after 10 months, we urge that workers immediately take matters into their own hands and undertake independent action and impose bans. 4. Students and youth must mobilise and fight for this perspective among workers at the docks, factories, warehouses, hospitals, schools, in transport, logistics, and other workplaces. And 5. Students must turn to the building of a socialist movement of the working class internationally against the outmoded capitalist system, which offers only a future of barbarism and nuclear catastrophe. The IYSSE and the SEP are alone in fighting for this program, and I would strongly encourage all young people attending this meeting today, in person, online, to turn away from appeals to capitalist governments and turn towards the working class as the only revolutionary social force that can stop the drive to nuclear war and dictatorship. Thank you.